Welcome to the Chemistry, Biology and Math Revision Hub. Today we're doing the Pearson Edexcel International A-Level Biology topics, and this is topic 1B. Topic 1B1, the principles of circulation. So we begin by looking at the need for transport in small organisms. These are usually single-celled organisms or small multicellular organisms. For small organisms, diffusion is the only way in which substances enter or leave the cells of those organisms. And as we know, diffusion is the free movement of particles in a liquid or gaseous state down a concentration gradient. So this is sufficient to supply oxygen, supply nutrients, and removal of wastes like carbon dioxide from the single-celled organisms and microscopic multicellular organisms. The next part, we look at the adaptations of small organisms for diffusion. Since these organisms use diffusion as a way of gaining oxygen and nutrients for also removal of waste, so the diffusion distance is going to be small, and they have a large surface area to volume ratio. This is surface area divided by the volume. That ratio is going to be small. Also, they have low metabolic demands because, of course, they do not carry out so many cellular processes. These organisms do not participate in regulating their body temperature like most multicellular organisms, so we see there is going to be sufficient supply of oxygen since they do not carry out a lot of respiration. Also, these cells do not use much oxygen and food, and again, this is working together with the points above. The cells do not produce much carbon dioxide, so we do not need to remove a lot of it. And again, this is the cell. We have the organelles inside. Oxygen is going to come in with the nutrients, and then on the other side, CO2 is going to go out. So since it's a single-celled organism, it carries out less respiration. It will require less oxygen, less nutrients, and the waste produced is going to be less, so diffusion can be efficient in ensuring that the nutrients and oxygen come in where the waste can go out. There is greater surface area, so diffusion can be efficient at bringing in enough oxygen that is required for cellular processes. Also, we talked about the diffusion distance being small, so this is going to enable easy movement of oxygen into the cell as well as the waste gases out of the cell. Here we're trying to get the concept of surface area to volume ratio, and again, this is from your textbook. If you have a cube of 1 millimeter, another of 2 millimeters, and the other of 4 millimeters, the surface area, which is supposed to be 6 times the length squared, so this is going to be 6 times 1 squared, which is equal to 6. The volume is going to be 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1, as you can see here. If we do similar calculations for this, a 2 millimeter cube, the surface area is going to be 6 times 2 squared, which is going to be 6 times 4, giving us 24. Then the volume is going to be 2 times 2 times 2, giving us 8 millimeters cubed. Surface area to volume ratio is going to be that. We can see this one has greater surface area to volume ratio, although it was the smallest. And for the 4 millimeter cube, of course, 6 times 4 squared is going to give us 96, and then the other 4 times 4 times 4 gives us 64. The surface area to volume ratio is 3 to 2, and we can see this one has the greatest surface area to volume ratio. Now, for multicellular organisms, they have multiple organs within them, and diffusion may not be an efficient way of bringing in nutrients from the outside to the inside, since many cells have to be given the right nutrients as well as oxygen. So diffusion from the external surface is not going to be efficient. That is why there are systems that allow for the distribution of these nutrients as well as oxygen onto the cells in the organs where they are found, as well as the removal of waste material. So, of course, there are many chemical reactions that are taking place in these multicellular organisms, and these will require a lot of nutrients as well as oxygen. So this must be transported from the outside, I'm talking about oxygen and nutrients, into the organism's cells, and these substances are used in the respiration, which is sufficient for the production of energy in the form of ATP as well as removal of waste. These waste substances include carbon dioxide, and if they are not removed from the cell, they could be toxic for the body. Now, to solve this, the circulatory system is accompanied by diffusion to efficiently deliver these substances as well as to remove waste from the organs. Like I say, there are systems that are going to distribute these nutrients. However, diffusion is going to help in the distribution closer to the cells within the organs. Moving on to transport systems in animals, here we have what we call the circulatory system, and this is going to be a system where we have fluids through which some of these substances are going to be transported around the body. The circulatory system in animals is a mass transport system. This system helps to overcome the limitations of diffusion. Like I said already, diffusion is not sufficient enough to distribute nutrients and oxygen from the outside of the body into the body for multicellular organisms that are not microscopic. So to overcome that, the circulatory system is going to distribute, and then as these nutrients come closer to the cells within the organs, the effusion can be used for distribution to the cells. Now, for these transport systems in animals, they have specific features that have to be taken into consideration. They should have exchange surfaces. Then these systems should have vessels, and these vessels are going to deliver the substances closer to the organs so that the effusion can efficiently deliver those substances or the nutrients to the cells that require them, as well as the removal of waste from the cells. These mass transport systems should also be good at making substances move in the right direction. So, for example, nutrients should be moving into the body and waste should be moving out of the body. This mass transport system should have ways of moving materials fast enough to supply the needs of the organism. And again, this is going to involve mechanical methods like, of course, the pumping of the heart to maintain the concentration gradient so that the substances move quickly from one place to the other. The example here is we have active transport where ATP is used in order to distribute substances where they are needed, even against the concentration gradient. A good mass transport system should have a suitable transport medium. This could be a fluid. For example, we have the plasma in our body. A good mass transport system should also have a way of adapting the rate of transport to the needs of the body by altering the sizes of the blood vessels in order to increase the pressure or decrease the pressure so that sufficient blood reaches the organs in the right amount of time, carrying the nutrients that are required. To introduce circulatory systems, we have two kinds. There are those we call open circulatory systems, as well as closed circulatory systems. In open circulatory system, blood is circulating in open spaces in the body, such as in insects. And then in closed circulatory system, here blood is contained in tubes or vessels within the animals. In this topic, we're going to be more concerned about closed circulatory system. And on that note, I'm going to talk about single circulatory system and double circulatory systems within animals. In single circulatory system, blood is going to move through the heart once in a complete cycle, while in double circulatory system, blood is going to move through the heart twice in one complete cycle. We are going to go through these circulatory systems in detail on the next pages. Beginning with single circulatory system, here blood moves through the heart once per cycle, and this is common in fish. So in this case, let's begin with blood comes into the heart, it's going to be pumped, and then it's going to be pumped to the gills where it's going to gain oxygen or where gaseous exchange is going to occur. Carbon dioxide goes out and then oxygen comes in. So when oxygen comes in, this is going to be sent to the rest of the body and then come back to the heart. So this is going to be blood moving through the heart once per cycle. Usually when teaching about circulation, people are more concerned with the inefficiencies of this single circulatory system. Because blood passes through the heart only once before it goes to the gills and it never returns to the heart to be pumped, it means a lot of pressure is going to be lost as the blood goes through the gills, and that means the organs are going to receive the blood at a lower pressure. So here I say the disadvantage is that blood reaches the organs at a lower pressure. However, since fish are aided by water in motion, this is not going to be a big hindrance to their movement or to the needs of the body. Now, when we go to double circulatory system, this is what we're going to focus on more. This is found mainly in birds and mammals. It is the most complex system and has two separate systems. There is systemic circulation and there is pulmonary circulation. The systemic carries oxygenated blood, which is oxygen-rich blood, from the heart to the cells of the body where oxygen is going to be used, and then carbon dioxide is going to be returned to the blood vessels. And then in pulmonary circulation, like the word suggests, pulmonary is connected with the lungs. So this is concerned with carrying the oxygenated blood away from the heart to the lungs so that the blood can be oxygenated before being returned back to the heart. When we get to topic 1b2, the roles of the blood. So here we're going to look at the components of blood. You need to know that the transport system in mammals is of course what we call the cardiovascular system. And in this system, blood is going to be the transport medium that carries everything that has to be distributed to the cells as well as removing waste. This blood is going to be carried through blood vessels of the circulatory system. Like I said already, it delivers materials that are needed by the cells. This is usually oxygen as well as nutrients, and it ensures that wastes are removed. These are metabolic wastes. Within the circulatory system, substances are going to move between the plasma red blood cells and the body cells by diffusion or active transport. Active transport is where energy is required to move substances against the concentration gradient. Blood contains plasma. It also contains red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and many more components. Also, blood transports soluble proteins like fibrinogen. This is used in the formation of fibrin so that blood clotting can occur. There are hormones, there are nutrients like glucose, amino acids, waste, and so on. Blood also helps in the distribution of heat around the body. Looking at the components of blood, the first thing we're going to look at is blood plasma. Like I already said, this is good for transportation of many substances that are found within the blood. And plasma is the liquid part of blood, and it makes up over 50% of the blood. Blood plasma carries your blood cells and everything that needs transporting around your body. This includes nutrients, excretory products like urea, hormones, digested food, and so on. It also helps to maintain a steady body temperature by distributing heat or by transferring heat from the internal organs to the skin. It also acts as a buffer to regulate pH changes within your body. Moving on to the cells, here we have the red blood cells, and sometimes these are called the erythrocytes. There are about 5 million red blood cells per millimeter cubed of blood, and they contain hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is very important in the binding of oxygen, so that oxygen is transported around our body. Also, these red blood cells are made in the bone marrow, and then they move into the blood. They have a limited lifespan of about 120 days. Mature red blood cells have no nucleus, so that they have more space to contain more hemoglobin for oxygen transport. Actually, this question is very common, asking you about the adaptations of red blood cells for transportation of oxygen. You can talk about the idea that they have no nucleus in order to have more space to pack up more hemoglobin in order to transport more oxygen. Also, red blood cells are biconcave in shape. This ensures that they have a large surface area for oxygen transport. Red blood cells transport oxygen from the lungs to all the body cells, and hemoglobin carries some of the carbon dioxide produced in respiration from tissues back to the lungs. We'll talk about this point a little bit later, explaining how hemoglobin is involved in the transportation of CO2. Moving on to the white blood cells, these are called leukocytes. They are much larger than the red blood cells. Like I said already, erythrocytes are red blood cells, so the white blood cells are much larger than these ones, and they are usually around 4,000 to 11,000 per millimeter cubed of blood. These are also made in the bone marrow. So these contain a nucleus and have colorless cytoplasm, although some types contain granules which can be stained. You'll talk about this granulation and staining in your second year when looking about the details of the immune response. The functions of white blood cells is, of course, to defend the body against infection and then to carry out some inflammatory response, which you'll see in your second year in detail. The last of the blood cells are platelets, or what they call thrombocytes. These are fragments of large cells called megakaryocytes, which are formed in the bone marrow. There are about 150,000 to 400,000 platelets per millimeter cubed of blood, and these platelets are involved in the process of blood clotting that we're going to look at later on in details. Moving on to transport of oxygen around the body, here we're going to focus on hemoglobin that is found in the red blood cells. We know hemoglobin is a molecule that is found in the red blood cells and is involved in the transportation of oxygen. A good structure of hemoglobin is what we see here. This contains 4 polypeptides, and an oxygen molecule is carried by each of the polypeptides. So each hemoglobin molecule is a large globular protein consisting of 4 polypeptide chains, each with an iron-containing prosthetic group. Then each hemoglobin can bind up to 4 molecules of oxygen in a reverse process to form oxyhemoglobin. So this means hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygen molecules in order to form oxyhemoglobin. You could write it as that, oxyhemoglobin. That is the hemoglobin carrying oxygen. In this part, we are looking at how oxygen is going to be transported by the hemoglobin, or loading and offloading of oxygen. When we talk about the lungs, this is going to be the loading process, how oxygen comes into the hemoglobin molecules. And then when we talk about the tissues, we're going to be talking about offloading, how oxygen leaves the hemoglobin to go to the tissues. During the loading process, or the binding process, the first oxygen molecule that binds the hemoglobin changes the arrangement of the molecule, making it easier for the following oxygen molecules to bind, meaning it becomes progressively easier to bind more oxygen, and the final oxygen molecule binds several hundred times faster than the initial one. So this same process happens in reverse when oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin, meaning in the tissues, it gets progressively harder to remove more oxygen. In the tissues, the oxygen levels are usually low, so the concentration of oxygen in the cytoplasm of the red blood cells is going to be higher than that in the surrounding tissues. So oxygen is going to easily leave the red blood cell, or I would say hemoglobin, to diffuse into the body cells down its concentration gradient, and hemoglobin molecules will give up some of their oxygen towards the tissues. Moving on to the oxygen dissociation curve, this shows the rate at which oxygen associates or binds and oxygen dissociates or comes off hemoglobin at different partial pressures of oxygen. We can see here as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, there is going to be more percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. However, we see in the beginning is not going to be as much, but between this region and this region here, we can see a small change in the partial pressure causes a greater change in the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, meaning within that region, there is more oxygen that can be taken up by a hemoglobin molecule. This is going to occur in association as well as dissociation. So this arrow here is for this part here, a high partial pressure of oxygen. These are going to be the conditions in the lungs, meaning there is going to be association of oxygen towards the hemoglobin molecules. And at low partial pressures of oxygen, this is within the tissues, we see there is going to be dissociation or loss of oxygen from the hemoglobin molecules into the tissues nearby. So the partial pressure of oxygen is the pressure exerted by oxygen within a mixture of gases. And the strong affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen means that a small change in the proportion of oxygen in the surrounding environment can have a big effect on the saturation of blood with oxygen. This is what I explained. Between this region here, this part and that part, you can see the curve increases rapidly, or I would say the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is going to be so high or so big within this region, and that is because there is going to be greater affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Like I said already, in the lungs, hemoglobin rapidly gains oxygen, and in the tissues, as the oxygen saturation of the environment is low, oxygen is going to be released rapidly. So moving away from oxygen transport, we're shifting to transport of CO2 or carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is transported as a bicarbonate, or I would say that like that. That is going to break down into H plus and HCO3 minus. This is something you see here. So the waste carbon dioxide diffuses from the respiring cells of the body tissues into the blood along a concentration gradient, meaning from higher concentration within the cells to a lower concentration within the blood. So a reaction is going to take place. The released carbon dioxide is going to react with water, producing this hydrogen carbonate, but this is unstable. It's going to split, producing the bicarbonate ion, then the hydrogen ion. But presence of this free hydrogen ion is going to decrease the pH of blood. So we have to find a way of controlling the pH of blood by not having a higher concentration of those hydrogen ions in the blood. So an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase is going to control the rate of this reaction. Again, that is a reversible reaction where carbonic acid is going to be produced. Most of the produced carbon dioxide is going to be transported in that form. However, about 5% of the carbon dioxide is going to be carried in solution in plasma. And then a further 10 to 20% is going to combine with hemoglobin to make aminohemoglobin, like we're going to see on the next page. Now take an example. These are tissue cells and CO2 comes out. This is going to enter the red blood cell and it's going to react with water or interact with the water within the cytoplasm and will produce the carbonic acid, which is that. But this carbonic acid is unstable, so it's going to split into the hydrogen ion and then the hydrogen carbonate ion. This could move out through a chloride shift where the chloride comes in order to balance charge. And this hydrogen is going to bind onto hemoglobin to form HHB, as we can see here. Like I said already, this process here is going to be catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which is going to catalyze that reaction. In this reaction, hemoglobin is acting as a buffer, accepting a hydrogen ion, which we see here, this part here. It accepts a hydrogen ion to form hemoglobinic acid, which is what we see here. That is what we call the HHB. And then this is going to prevent the free hydrogen ions from being present in blood to lower the pH of the blood. So if H plus binds onto hemoglobin, it's not going to be free. So there will be less effect in decreasing the pH of the blood and therefore we say this reaction is going to help in the buffering action of the blood to prevent change in pH. Moving on to the Bohr effect, this is there to describe the ability of red blood cells to adapt to changes in their biochemical environment. They do this by maximizing the oxygen binding capability or capacity. In the lungs, I would say this should be the optimum delivery of oxygen to the tissues when there is greater demand. Hemoglobin as a molecule needs high levels of oxygen to become saturated with oxygen. If you want the speed of association to be fast, then we need to have higher partial pressures of oxygen. In active tissues, meaning these tissues that are respiring, where there is carbon dioxide that is produced, we see there is going to be low partial pressure of oxygen. So this hemoglobin molecule is going to release oxygen more readily. So the key thing here is at a place where there is higher partial pressure of oxygen, there is going to be faster association. But in a place where there is going to be lower partial pressure of oxygen, there is going to be faster unloading or faster release of oxygen to those specific tissues. Looking at this graph, we can compare A, B, and C. We can see here there is 10.6 kilopascals of carbon dioxide, and we can see this is going to be the most CO2, while the other side we have 2.7 kilopascals of carbon dioxide, so this is going to be the least CO2. So we'd expect if there is the most CO2, there is going to be ease dissociation of oxygen. That is why you see the curve for C shifts to the right. So there is going to be less oxygen that is going to be associated at the same partial pressure of oxygen. We can see if I draw this vertical line, at the same partial pressure of oxygen, A has a higher saturation with oxygen, and this part here, which is C, has the least because it's in an environment or in an area where there is more CO2 in comparison to A. So this graph is showing you those shifts depending on the biochemical environment, how much oxygen is going to associate with hemoglobin or how much oxygen is going to be released by hemoglobin depending on the biochemical environment around the specific hemoglobin molecules. Moving on to fetal hemoglobin, of course you should know fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen in comparison to the adult hemoglobin of the mother. So we expect the adult hemoglobin of the mother's curve to be to the right of that of fetal hemoglobin, meaning at the same partial pressure of oxygen, we expect fetal hemoglobin to have a higher saturation with oxygen in comparison to the maternal hemoglobin. You can see it here. There is more saturation within the baby than the mother. This ensures that oxygen is always going to move from the mother towards the fetus so that the fetus does not starve if there is less oxygen in the environment. We need to know that maternal and fetal blood move in opposite directions, and this ensures that there is always better chances for diffusion of oxygen to occur from the mother's blood into the blood of the fetus. In simple terms, this maximizes the oxygen transfer to the blood of the fetus in order to sustain life. Moving on to blood clotting. Blood clotting is a mechanism in which blood vessels are sealed to minimize blood loss and prevent pathogens from getting into the specific damaged area. When there is damage, plasma, blood cells, and platelets flow from the cut vessel. So contact between the platelets and the components of the tissues is going to cause the platelets to break open, releasing thromboplastin as well as serotonin. Serotonin is going to cause the smooth muscles within the blood vessels to contract. This is very important. When this contraction occurs, blood vessels are going to be narrowed, cutting off the blood supply or blood flow towards that area. And then when thromboplastin is released from the platelets, this is an enzyme that is going to catalyze the conversion of prothrombin into thrombin, and this is going to lead to the cascade of reactions that occur resulting into blood clotting. So that clotting cascade I talked about, it is kind of complex, but we need some clotting factors like vitamin K, which is important in the production of many compounds needed for blood clots to be formed, including prothrombin. So on the next page, let's look at this clotting cascade. Like we said already, there is going to be damage to the tissues, and then there's going to be release of these platelets. These platelets could burst open or break apart, and when they break, they release thromboplastin, which is an active enzyme that catalyzes the conversion of prothrombin into thrombin. However, for this enzyme to catalyze that reaction, we need calcium ions to be present. So if prothrombin is present and the calcium ions as well as thromboplastin, then prothrombin is going to be converted into thrombin. So thrombin is an active enzyme that catalyzes the conversion of soluble fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin. You need to know this is insoluble and this is going to be soluble. So fibrin, are kind of fibers that are going to trap blood cells, leading to the formation of a clot around the area where damage has occurred. Moving on to topic 1b3, circulation in the blood vessels. Blood vessels are of three types. We have the arteries, we have the veins, and then the capillaries. These blood vessels have different structures in order to carry out their functions appropriately, as we're going to see. They're adapted for different functions. Beginning with the arteries, we can see these, of course, arteries carry blood away from the heart towards the organs. And since they're carrying blood away from the heart, we expect this blood to be at high pressure, so they should be adapted to withstand the high pressure of the blood that they carry within them. Almost all arteries carry oxygenated blood. Of course, there is an exception, number one, the pulmonary artery, because this carries blood away from the heart but towards the lungs. That blood is going to be deoxygenated, so we can say that is the exception. And the other is going to be the umbilical artery. During pregnancy, this carries deoxygenated blood from the fetus to the placenta. Among subdivisions of arteries, we have what we call arterioles. These are smaller branches of the arterial system. They are further away from the heart as you come closer to the organs. Blood pressure within the arteries is going to be relatively high in comparison to all the other blood vessels. Looking at the structure of an artery, of course, we see there is an external tough layer. This one is going to be the outside layer. And then there is a lumen we can see inside here. This is where blood is going to be carried here on the inside. So the lumens of the arteries are usually small. This is unstretched. However, when blood is carried at high pressure, there is the ability of this lumen to change its size in order to be able to accommodate more blood. So the diameter of the lumen could be slowly changed. But in an unstretched state, the lumen of the artery is going to be small. The middle layer, which we see this one here, is going to contain elastic fibers and smooth muscles. Elastic fibers ensure that when this lumen is stretched, increase in the lumen size can occur in order to accommodate more blood. Arteries nearest to the heart contain more elastic fibers because, of course, that's where we're going to see more blood pressure as the blood leaves the heart. Then arteries further from the heart have more proportions of muscle tissue. When we go to the endothelial lining, this is the layer that is making up the lumen. It is a smooth lining which allows the easiest blood flow, meaning it decreases the friction as it goes through these blood vessels. Moving on to capillaries. As arteries deliver blood away from the heart towards the organs, the arterioles are the smallest subdivisions of the arteries that lead the blood into the capillary network. The capillary network is linked to arterioles as well as the venules. So you'd expect these are arteries. Then we see they're going to branch down into the smaller arterioles. These connect to the capillaries, and then on the other side, as the oxygenated blood leaves the organ, we're going to see the venules that later connect into the veins, so that blood returns to the heart. Capillaries are one cell thick, and within the organs, no cell is far from a capillary, so substances can be able to diffuse between the cells as well as the blood quickly, meaning the diffusion distance is going to be small. Also, the diameter of each individual capillary is quite small. Blood travels slowly through these capillaries, giving more opportunity for diffusion to occur, meaning we need to have efficient diffusion so blood travels through those capillaries quite slowly to allow the exchange of gases to occur efficiently, as well as the delivery of nutrients. The walls of these capillaries are one cell thick and contain no elastic fiber, as well as smooth muscle or collagen. It's going to allow the diffusion distance to be quite small. Looking at the structure of a capillary, we can see this is the inside, or what you call the lumen. We can see the outside of the exterior is made out of cells. We can see this is one cell thick to minimize the diffusion distance. We can see oxygen is easily going to come out into the tissues, and carbon dioxide is easily going to leave the tissues into this capillary because the diffusion distance is quite small. If you look at this image here, we can see a single red blood cell can almost cover the whole lumen of the capillary. It means it's quite small. So there is going to be easy exchange of oxygen as it leaves the hemoglobin molecules within the red blood cells onto the surrounding tissues. It's going to have a shorter distance, so there is going to be efficient diffusion or gaseous exchange, as well as efficient delivery of nutrients from the capillary to the cells nearby. Moving on to veins, this is the third set of blood vessels and the final one. Veins carry blood back towards the heart, and most veins, of course, carry the oxygenated blood, except two. The pulmonary vein, this carries blood that has been oxygenated from the lungs back to the heart so that it can be circulated to the rest of the body. And then the umbilical vein, again, this is during pregnancy, it carries oxygenated blood from the placenta to the fetus in order for oxygen to be delivered. As blood moves away from the organs into the veins, it first goes through tiny venules. These are connected to the capillaries, combining into larger and larger vessels as blood goes back to the heart, and these are later going to lead into the veins. Veins have blood at low pressure, and they do not need thick walls like we saw in the arteries. Arteries need thick walls in order to withstand the pressure, as they carry blood at high pressure when it's leaving the heart towards the organs. We have two major veins, the inferior vena cava, which brings blood from the lower parts of the body towards the heart, and we have the superior vena cava, which brings blood from the upper part of the body, meaning the head as well as the arms, back to the heart. The blood pressure in the veins is relatively low, and also blood returns to the heart through the veins by means of muscle pressure and one-way valves, as we're going to see a little bit later. This is an example of a structure of a vein. We can see veins have the outer layer, which is large and consists of mainly collagen fibers. They also have the relatively thin layer of smooth muscles with fewer elastic fibers. So it means since the lumen is bigger, we do not need much elasticity. We have the smooth inner surface, which is that one here. So since blood moves through the veins without being at very high pressure, the adaptation of a vein to carry its function is mainly having valves in order to prevent the backflow of blood. So when we look at the venous pump, this is similar to what we talked about previously, blood being carried back through the veins by the help of muscle contraction of the muscles closer to the veins. So here imagine this is a vein and it's surrounded by these muscles. Within this vein we have valves. So in this case this valve is open because you can see blood is going to be flowing into that direction. And this valve here is closed. That is why the backflow of blood does not occur into this section. It just remains within that section as the valve closes. The similar thing we see here, this valve is closed and that valve is closed. So backflow of blood is going to be avoided. However, in this situation, we can see the muscle is contracted. As this muscle contracts, it makes this part here smaller, pushing the blood from this section of the vein into the next section of the vein. And we can see this is going to be what we call the venous pump, meaning the muscles closer to the vein are going to contract in order to act as a pushing mechanism for blood to leave one section of the vein into the next section of the vein. And as contraction stops, the valves are going to close so that blood does not return back or the backflow of blood does not occur. So here you say during intense activity, the muscles will contract and this squeezes the veins, enabling the valves to open. So blood moves out of the section of the vein into the next towards the heart so that these valves can prevent the backflow of blood into the previous section. Looking at blood vessel characteristics, of course here we're going to look at the larger arteries. This is as blood comes from the heart. Then we look at the smaller arteries. Then we go to the arterioles. These are the smallest as you come closer to capillaries. So capillaries, venules, and then the veins. We're going to study three factors. There is total area, there is velocity, as well as blood pressure. So blood pressure is going to be the highest in the arteries. Of course, the carrying oxygenated blood from the heart is going to be at high pressure because the ventricles must have pumped the blood out at high pressure. So the pressure is going to slightly decrease as this blood moves away from the large arteries towards the smaller arteries. And when it reaches towards the capillaries, it's going to greatly decrease. And then it never goes back high. As it returns in the veins, it's going to still remain at low pressure. Now looking at the velocity, like I said here, velocity of the blood flow is inversely proportional to the cross-sectional area. So if the velocity goes down, we expect the total area to go high. And if the total area goes down, then the velocity is going to increase. So it means the arteries are going to have small. And then as we reach the capillaries, the total area is going to increase because they have greater surface area. And then as we go down to the veins, it's going to decrease again. So that is for total area. And since total area and velocity are going to be inversely proportional, so we expect the velocity to go in the opposite direction, decrease, and then increase towards the end. Moving on to topic 1b4, the mammalian heart. So here we're looking at the structure of the heart. We can see there is what we call the right atrium here. This is where the oxygenated blood enters the heart too. And then we have the inferior vena cava, of course. This is bringing blood from the lower part of the body, and the superior vena cava bringing blood from the upper part of the body, meaning the head as well as the arms. The right atrium here is going to contract, pushing blood into this region, which is the right ventricle. The right ventricle is made of thinner cardiac muscle because it does not contract that much, while you see the other side, the left ventricle is made of thick cardiac muscle because it has to carry out greater or stronger contraction in order to pump blood to further distances away from the heart, so blood has to be at a higher pressure. There is a separator, which we call the septum, separating the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart. Moving on to the left side of the heart, we have the pulmonary vein that brings blood away from the lungs towards the heart. This blood is going to be oxygenated. It comes into the left atrium. That is going to contract, and the bicuspid valve is going to open, forcing the blood into the left ventricle. As the left ventricles pump, of course, this valve is going to close, and then blood is going to be pumped out of there through the aorta to the rest of the body. You need to know the labeling and the function of the base structures of the heart, the chambers of the heart, the valves of the heart, and describing double circulation basically in the human heart. So like I already said, talking about the structure of the heart, the right side of the heart receives blood from the body and pumps it to the lungs. Then the left side of the heart is going to receive blood from the lungs and pump it to the body or to the rest of the body. The two sides of the heart are separated by a thick muscular septum. This is very important. And the heart is made up of a unique type of muscle, which we call the cardiac muscle. You'll study more about this in your 12th grade. The coronary artery brings oxygenated blood to the cardiac muscle because the heart muscle itself also needs to carry out respiration in order to sustain the muscular activity of the heart or the contractions of the ventricle. Looking into how the heart works, of course, the beating of our body produces the sound we hear as a heartbeat. And these sounds are actually not due to the contraction of the heart, but they are due to the heart valves closing. The two sounds of a heartbeat are often described as lapped up. So the first one, which we call the lap, comes from the ventricles contracting and as the blood is forced against the atrioventricular valves. These include the tricuspid valves as well as the bicuspid valves, these being on the right side and the others being on the left side. Then the dab comes from the ventricles relaxing and the backflow of blood hits the semilunar valves in the pulmonary artery as well as the aorta. An average normal person has about 72 beats per minute. This could be important. So looking to the cardiac cycle, of course, we have systole as well as diastole. So the contraction of the heart, if the heart is contracting or any part of the heart, we say it's in systole. So atriosystole is when the atria contract together, forcing blood into the ventricles. And that means ventricular systole is when the ventricles contract. This happens about 0.13 seconds after atriosystole, meaning there is a momentary delay. So when ventricular systole occurs, the blood is going to be pumped out of the ventricles into either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. So to demonstrate that, here we can see blood is going to leave that into the ventricle and here to the ventricle. We can see these are the atrioventricular valves. We have the bicuspid valve and then the tricuspid valves. When this blood moves into the ventricles, the artery are going to be contracting and that will be atriosystole. And afterwards, the ventricles are going to contract. We see this is going to be ventricular systole. And as they do, blood is going to be pumped from the ventricles into the specific blood vessels. This goes into the pulmonary artery and that goes into the aorta to the rest of the body, while this goes to the lungs. So one cycle of systole and diastole makes up a single heartbeat, which lasts about 0.8 seconds in humans. Moving on to topic 1b5, atherosclerosis. Now, the details of atherosclerosis, this involve damage to the endothelial cell lining, which could occur due to blood pressure or as a result of smoking. The chemicals within smoke can irritate the endothelial layer, causing damage, and when this damage occurs, inflammatory response is going to occur. White blood cells are going to arrive at the damaged site, and these immune cells could accumulate chemicals from blood, especially cholesterol. Cholesterol is going to build up, fatty deposits are going to form, and this is what we call the atheroma. Then when fibrous tissues and calcium ions build up around the atheroma, it's going to harden and it becomes hardened plaque, like you can see this one here. So the arterial wall or the walls of the artery are going to become rigid. So if this happens continuously, there could be further damage within the blood vessel, as we're going to see a little bit later. So as a result of atherosclerosis, sometimes they could result into aneurysms. So within the artery where the plaque has occurred, blood tends to collect behind the blockage. The artery is going to bulge and the wall is put under more pressure than usual, so it can become weakened and an aneurysm could be formed. Aneurysms frequently happen in blood vessels supplying to the brain, and if that occurs, it could lead to other complications. Again, in connection to the heart, we're going to look at heart disease. These heart diseases are all linked to atherosclerosis, and number one is going to be angina. For angina, during exercise, the narrowed coronary arteries cannot supply enough oxygenated blood to the heart muscle, and so the muscle is going to resort to anaerobic respiration. But you know, anaerobic respiration is going to lead to lactic acid production, and the ATP produced here is going to be less. So this causes a gripping pain in the chest that can extend into the arms and the jaw, and this often causes breathlessness. But if somebody stops exercise, this condition or the pain can go away. But during myocardial infarction, or what we call a heart attack, there is chest pain that is going to be experienced, and this of course could be connected to atherosclerosis due to insufficient supply of oxygen to the heart muscle. But in this situation, this is going to be severe, that there could be permanent blockage to one area leading to specific regions of the heart muscle. And so if it's starved of oxygen and nutrients, it's not going to carry out aerobic respiration, and a heart attack could be the result. Stroke is when there is interruption in normal blood supply, mainly to the brain. So if this occurs, it means a specific region of the brain cannot get enough oxygen as well as nutrients for aerobic respiration. So this could cause that region not to function properly. And if it controls major areas of the body, then this could lead to widespread damage. Depending on how much the brain is affected, different people can have different symptoms of strokes. Like very often, blood is cut off from one part or one side of the brain only. So these symptoms could be dizziness, confusion, slurred speech, blurred vision, partial loss of vision, usually in one eye, numbness. However, this could be severe, leading to paralysis that could occur in one side of the body. So this brings us to the end of this topic. Thank you for being with us. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.